This is a 9 Eyewitness News special report.
Washington remains under a state of emergency tonight after the worst terrorist attack on U.S. soil and in U.S. history. Good evening. I'm Gurveer Dinza.
I'm Gordon Peterson. We will return to CBS News coverage and bring you President Bush's address at 8:30. But first, we want to update you on what's happening here.
Now, as we do, remember that all the local school closings and office closings are going to be scrolled at the bottom of your screen throughout the evening, so you can keep up to date on that.
Now, the Pentagon continues to smolder tonight, 10 hours after terrorists hijacked a jumbo jet and crashed it. Dave Statter has the latest in this live report. Dave.
Doesn't just smolder. A good deal of fire still in there. We've talked to firefighters and people who've been up close to the building. Certainly, we can see the smoke. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, as you look at the building, said when asked about the casualties there, the number of dead, he said it will not be a few. We've talked to firefighters who've been in the building or people who've been up there at the building and say they have seen bodies. This is what it looked like this morning at 9:45 when American Airlines Flight 77, a 757, crashed into the Pentagon. A gaping hole now in the Pentagon. Urban search and rescue teams, we are told, are in there from Fairfax and Montgomery doing their reconnaissance, figuring out their plan of attack. Again, they have seen bodies inside the Pentagon. According to the briefing early, wants to get back into some sort of business tomorrow. And Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld was asked, can you guarantee the safety of Pentagon workers?
A terrorist can attack at any time, at any place, using any technique. It is physically impossible to defend at every time, in every place, against every technique. It is not possible to give guarantees. The people who work in this building do so voluntarily. They're brave people, and they do their jobs well.
Fires continue to burn, will burn for quite a while. Back to you at Broadcast House.
Dave Statter, thank you very much. The Virginia Hospital Center in Arlington is where the victims from the Pentagon were taken.
The hospital received its first victim at 10:35 this morning. There were more to come. Jennifer Ryan standing by at the hospital with an update. Jennifer?
Gordon Gurveer, this hospital has seen more casualties than any hospital in our area. The wounded toll is now up again this hour to 42. 42 people injured in this attack, 21 of them treated and released. 14 have been admitted tonight, and we're told that 8 are in critical condition. Of those 8 in critical, there are 4 that are on respirators. We have video for you as well. We want to tell you that most of the wounded that we're seeing at this hour that are transported here are emergency workers, crews from the field, medics, firefighters who have been brought in here with injuries. Many of the injuries today, smoke inhalation, broken bones, burns to the face and hands, cuts, lacerations. We've also seen volunteers come here today to help. A woman named Lee Corey of Arlington works at the local financial arm of Morgan Stanley. It is headquartered at the World Trade Center. She has only heard word on one of her coworkers in New York.
As many as possible were going down those stairs. We did hear from one man who had been on his way out and was at the second floor. He called one of my coworkers and said, I'm out, I'm over in another building, and that the water sprinklers had gone off, and that it was a very, very frightening experience for him.
That was Lee Corey. She was one of the folks that came here tonight. We are at the Virginia Hospital Center in Arlington. No fatalities here tonight. Nobody brought in who had died, and nobody has passed since. But they think that they may have only gotten the very first of the people hurt in this attack. Jennifer Ryan, back to you.
Jennifer Ryan, thanks very much.
Well, the events of today have been overwhelming, and it might take a while for the true horror of what happened to hit a lot of us.
Yeah, but after the numbness wears off, you might want to talk to somebody about this, and we have some counselors standing by who will talk to you. The number is 202-432-9045, 202-432-9045. These folks will be on hand until 9 o'clock tonight if you want to chat with them.
And again, just to bring you up to date, I know this is something that's been going on all day, and many of you have been watching it unfold on television. A lot of people watched that second plane hit the second tower of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center live on television, and then, of course, at the Pentagon. And tonight, reports of anti-missile fire in Afghanistan, talk of who may be responsible for this attack on U.S. soil.
Well, Secretary Rumsfeld has specifically said these attacks, if they are attacks, were not mounted by the United States.
That's right. The U.S. is denying any responsibility for those in Afghanistan.
There's some speculation it might be the rebels taking advantage of this situation.
But again, we're watching what is going on at the Pentagon still. Many bodies believed to be still inside. And, of course, the rescue effort and recovery effort continues at the World Trade Center building in New York.
CBS News coverage of the attack on America now continues here on 9 WUSA.
Stand shoulder to shoulder with our American friends in this hour of tragedy. And we, like them, will not rest until this evil is driven from our world.
More than not just resting, in Britain they were rattled. Offices closing early in London's financial centre, commercial air traffic over the capital banned, as airlines here and throughout Europe cancelled transatlantic flights.
I'm certain in the short term we're going to face a much more restricted world, a world which is much more security conscious, much more anxious and much more fearful.
With European TV broadcasting live and non-stop, European governments called emergency meetings. So did NATO. Another echo of the attack in America were the questions asked here. Who was behind it and what happens now? The Taliban regime's ambassador to Pakistan today was part of the chorus calling for justice. He also insisted Osama bin Laden wasn't behind it. Bin Laden's not in contact with anyone, the ambassador insisted, and couldn't carry out such activity. It would be a great risk, he warned, for America to retaliate before completing an investigation. While Britain's calling mass terrorism a new evil the world needs to fight, some Europeans are more blunt. Germany calls the attack a declaration of war against the civilized world. But what all the allies are saying tonight is that America's not in this fight alone. Richard Roth, CBS News, London.
As we await President Bush's address to the nation and the world, which will be coming up in about 23 minutes now on the half-hour mark, joining us here in New York again is Sandy Berger, who served as National Security Advisor to President Bill Clinton, and in our CBS News Washington Bureau, Democratic Senator Christopher Dodd of Connecticut. Thank you both for being with us. First, Senator Dodd, there's been an awful lot of talk today about the United States. We will find who's responsible for this and we will punish them. Why is anybody who hates the United States, why would they believe this when in the past we have proven time and again we can't find out who does the people who do these things, and we've been unable to punish them, really?
Well, first of all, Dan, let me step back for a second and tell you my thoughts, and I'm sure the thoughts of Sandy. I just left about 500 members of Congress on the east front of the Capitol where the leadership, Republicans and Democrats, joined together in expression of solidarity and sympathy for the literally hundreds of people, and I expect thousands who may have lost their lives today. We don't know the numbers yet, as you've reported accurately here, but it's hard to begin any discussion of this without talking about these families and what our country has gone through. And today, you used the language at the outset of your news tonight, using Franklin Delano Roosevelt's language almost 60 years ago, 12 weeks from now, calling this a day of infamy, and it truly is. So I wanted to begin there, and Tom Daschle and Trent Lott are going to have tomorrow a session on resolutions and an opportunity for us to be heard. Congress will be in session tomorrow. Democracy will always triumph over terrorism. And I hope here that we'll first of all concentrate on the tragedy here at home, do what's been suggested by some of your earlier guests, and find out exactly who is responsible here. And I'm confident we can do that. And go a step further here. And I'll be interested in what Sandy has to say about this, but I think a new chapter's been turned here. Too often we have sort of accepted other nations' notion that they would harbor these people, occasionally provide some financing, even training for them, and that they sort of had to do that for their own domestic security. I think those days are over with. I think any nation that supports, harbors, trains these individuals, whether it's Osama bin Laden or others who are responsible for it, there needs to be a collective response. You heard today President Putin. I think the Chinese made similar statements. This is a chance for the civilized world now, if nothing else comes out of this, to respond in the most aggressive and thorough way we can. This cancer is hitting all of us, and we need to respond to it accordingly.
Now, back to the original question, Senator. Are we capable of determining who did these things? And then are we capable of, in some way, finding them, bringing them to justice, punishing them?
I believe so. I think, first of all, this was a highly coordinated, very sophisticated attack here today. And I'm quite confident that the collective intelligence efforts of our allies, friends who have expressed support for us today, that we'll be able to determine that. We may not do it as quickly as some would like, and my hope would be that we'll do it smartly. It's very important that we know what we're talking about before we respond. But I'm very confident we can do it, and I think we have the means of doing it. It may not be as fast as some would like, but I believe it can be done.
Sandy Berger, where are those voices in the world of Islam? Islam being one of the world's great religions. Where are those voices? Are there any, in any place that counts, who say, listen, we've had enough of this, and we will help the United States find and bring to justice these people?
Well, I think we have to be careful, Dan, that we don't condemn the world of Islam here. Obviously, there are a billion people who practice Islam around the world. This is perpetrated by a group, and we need to deal aggressively with the group. But I agree with Chris. We need the cooperation and concerted effort of all of our allies and friends, whether they are in Europe, whether they're in the Arab world or elsewhere, because we are now in a new phase of this war against terrorism. This is a watershed event, and we're not going to deal with this in one fell swoop. This is going to require a sustained, serious operation. And I think it's time for the American people to support the president, buckle our seatbelts, because this is going to be a long, hard ride.
True or untrue that in the past when there have been terrorist acts, nothing on this scale has happened, but when there have been terrorist acts, many of our friends and, yes, allies in the Arab world and elsewhere have been afraid to help us respond beyond a certain point because of fear of instability in their own countries.
Well, I think that's true, but this is so qualitatively different than anything we have seen before that we'll quickly decide, we'll quickly know who stands with the terrorists, who stands with disorder, and who stands with a world in which this kind of act is not tolerated. And I think we're going to have to put some of our friends to the test on this.
Senator Chris Dodd, what are the options for the president in increasing the pressure on, yes, our friends and allies to help more, great deal more and faster to deal with the people who perpetrate these kinds of crimes?
Well, it's hard to find any silver linings in what has occurred in the last 12 hours. But if there is any at all, it may be what we've heard already from leaders from around the globe that we haven't heard from in the past when we faced acts of terrorism not on this scale. And I would hope the president would pick up that phone. I'm confident he will. And by the way, all of us stand with him tonight. Anyone who's questioning whether or not this country is divided at all on this issue ought to put those notions aside. Democrats, Republicans, regardless of people's political feelings, we stand behind this president. He's our leader, and if he asks us to do some things in the coming days, he's going to find a united Congress, in my view. But he should also, I would hope, reach out to the allies who've spoken today, and even some of our major competitors in the globe who face similar challenges. This is a cancer that affects all of us. And I'm very confident if he does. There's been a lot of criticism about the administration in the first 8 months or so on the Kyoto agreements and on various other international efforts that we seem to be backing up. In a sense, I hope the president now realizes how important it is, I'm confident he will, that he reach out to these leaders and form that kind of coalition that, as Sandy has said, and he's absolutely right about this, systematically deals with this in the coming years. It's not a one response to this. It's not one attack. It's not going to be solved by one particular raid. This has got to be a systematic, seamless garment that goes on for a long time.
Sandy Berger, in the past, our history, the history of this country, shows that we're sometimes slow to recognize a danger. The build-up to World War II comes to mind. But when there is a Pearl Harbor, or when we're attacked, almost pushed off the Korean Peninsula, once we mobilize as a people, that we are indeed a determined and effective adversary, but we're dealing with such a shadowy operation as these terrorist organizations. Is it capable to put the nation on a one nation united, let's solve this problem, let's defeat this enemy, or impossible?
I have no question that the president can do that, but I think the American people need to understand that this is not going to be solved with one missile attack. We may have to reach deep into a faraway place in a very robust way to deal with this problem. We may have to do this over a sustained period of time, and those actions themselves will have their own consequences. So there's no silver bullet, literally or figuratively here, that is going to deal with the kind of unspeakable evil that we've seen today, the escalation in a massive way, both in terms of capability and malevolent intent that we've seen today. What we need now is buckle down, a serious, concerted effort that's going to have to be long range. We've taken down terrorist organizations like Abu Nidal in the 70s. This is qualitatively different And we're, I think, capable of doing it. I think the American people will support the president, but it's going to take actions we may not have contemplated in the past.
Sandy Berger, Senator Chris Dodd, thank you very much. We're less than 15 minutes away now from the President of the United States addressing the American people and the world about the events of today. In the meantime, let's remind ourselves there were many scenes of heroism as well as horror in the Twin Towers attack here in New York City. CBS's Lee Cowan reports on the people in the streets amid rubble and chaos. I warn you in advance, caution you in advance of the violence in some of these scenes. With that in mind, Lee?
Well, Dan, I think anyone down here this morning will tell you that there simply wasn't any time to do anything. Wasn't time to think, wasn't time to breathe. Certainly there wasn't time to mourn. The only thing you could do is run, and if you could, help.
For those inside the World Trade Center, it wasn't just hell on earth. For Bob Fox, it was hell 39 stories up.
It was unbelievable. I was on the 39th floor about 8:45 when a tremendous explosion hit.
Those lucky enough to get out walked out of one danger right into another. A moonscape of ash and debris, smoke and fire, leaking gas, and already the smell of death.
Debris, smoke, all the dust, everything, just couldn't see nothing. And I was praying to God then that, let me get by this now.
Ironworker Tony Cabrera rushed toward the carnage to try and help.
Then I seen the second plane hit. And I went into this lobby. And I went into the lobby. I was there with the fire department and everything, and just, it was starting to give away. This and that, pieces of people coming down, parts, and whatever.
Never seen anything like it.
Never.
Rescuers were at a loss. Smoke so thick they couldn't see the damage. The clamor of falling debris so loud they couldn't hear the cries for help. All of it made worse when the first of the Twin Towers came tumbling down upon them.
Go! On! Let's go! Let's go!
After the first series of explosions, there was hardly time to get in, and those that did were right in line of fire for the next series of explosions.
As the second tower collapsed, Val Coleman had a front row seat to disaster, watching it all unfold out of his apartment window just 5 blocks away.
And a great blossom of flame, a huge red fireball, scared the hell out of me.
Val Coleman was inside the World Trade Center just 15 minutes before the initial attack and remembers the last person he talked with.
A very nice young man answered me very politely. I left, came back here, and boom, he's probably dead.
And as he sat watching the building burn, Coleman could see tiny black specks near the top floors. They were people jumping off instead of being burned alive.
I must have seen 10 or 15 people come down, one after another.
Off the top?
Off what appeared to be the top.
The bombings today brought one horrific scene after another.
Oh my God! Oh my God!
But rescuers know once they get closer to what's left of the Twin Towers, the images are sure to get worse.
But the workers, for many of them, though, they are still waiting. We are told now, Dan, that firefighters are trying to stretch ladders out across some of the debris to begin putting out some of the fires that have been burning all day long. But active search and rescue efforts are still on hold at this hour. There is still hope here tonight. But for the moment, it's being tempered by an overwhelming sense of helplessness. Dan.
Lee Cowan, one of our many reporters covering in Lower Manhattan. The terror attacks on the World Trade Center struck deep into the hearts of New Yorkers. Many were witness to or victims of this cowardly act of mass destruction. CBS's Mika Brzezinski has been out among them on the streets of New York.
There was terror in the streets while the Twin Towers burned. With gridlock on the ground, crowds watched from afar and prayed.
You don't see people jumping from the windows.
Police jumped into action, moving the crowds behind police lines, away from danger.
Let's go!
But not far enough. One after another, the towers fell to pieces, debris falling onto hundreds of onlookers. Somewhere behind the billow of smoke, an American icon had disappeared, transforming the New York skyline forever. On the sidelines, people watched and wept. Others covered in soot and debris.
Come on, can you stop off? Come on.
Counted their blessings. Even now, no one can guess the number of dead and wounded. Adding to the confusion, cell service was crippled, cutting the lifeline for families trying to locate loved ones. Only a few could get through.
It's gonna be okay.
Nearby schools evacuated so quickly parents had no idea where to go to find their children. Everywhere there was terror and confusion.
Everybody, please start walking towards the east side.
Finally, people simply walked away from lower Manhattan. An eerie calm prevailed as police evacuated the area. Cell phone service for much of New York City is still somewhat crippled, though the situation is getting better. Several forms of transportation have been affected. Several subway lines are suspended indefinitely, and train service out of the city is limited. It will be no business as usual for school kids in New York City tomorrow. All New York City public schools are closed, at least for tomorrow. And the mayor of New York said earlier today, stay home and stay calm. At least try. Dan.
Nika Brzezinski. The specter is being raised tonight of hundreds and perhaps thousands, that's a quote from one New York City official, hundreds, perhaps thousands of people being, in effect, buried alive by the avalanche of destruction which developed in the wake of the two planes hitting the World Trade Centers today. Keep in mind that some rescue workers, firemen and policemen early on the scene were believed to have been killed. They've been unable to put out all the fires, much less get into the rubble and look for possible survivors in the rubble. That's the reality of this dark night in New York City. Now an eyewitness report from one of our own. Minutes after the initial attacks on the World Trade Center towers, CBS News correspondent Carol Maureen was on the scene, just in time for a frighteningly close encounter with catastrophe.
As I'm making my way toward the Trade Center along the water line, thousands of people were walking towards me, streaming out, almost not talking, trying to get through on cell phones that didn't work. Some of them crying, all of them looking pretty agonized. All of a sudden, I heard a roar, and I saw one of the towers blow and then collapse and fill the horizon with smoke, and I yelled, "Oh my God." And I saw from street level, as though it had exploded up, a giant rolling ball of flame, and the firefighters screamed, "Run." And I turned to run, but I fell, and I felt someone scoop me up, tell me to throw my high heels off, and I was running in my stocking feet with him. And finally, as we ran and ran, he slammed me into a wall and covered my body with his. I could feel his heart beating against my backbone. And I think both of us were sure we were dead, because there was no way you could run fast enough, and there was no way to avoid it. But somehow we escaped the flame, which was immediately followed by a storm of debris. We were breathing, it felt like giant particles of plaster, and there was smoke, so that if you tried to put your hand out in front of you, you couldn't really see it. It was the thickest, most intense particle and smoke I've ever been in. And somewhere along the line, the firefighter handed me off to a New York police officer. The thing that struck me, though, was that I didn't see many wounded people in the street, which led me to believe, at least where I was by the Trade Center, they had never even gotten out of the building. I thought I was going to die. It is as close as I've ever come as a reporter to thinking I was going to die.
Carol Maureen of 60 Minutes 2, CBS News correspondent. The shock of this morning's attack on America wasn't just felt in the cities where the hijacked planes were crashed. It was also felt in the cities where those flights began. CBS's Wyatt Andrews is in Boston tonight.
At Boston's Logan Airport, where two of the hijacked planes originated, scores of relatives of the victims were met by airline officials for consolation and were then taken to a nearby hotel to await information. American Airlines lost its Los Angeles-bound Flight 11, and the airline confirmed the identity of its lost pilot, Captain John Oganowski, who was 52 and a 22-year veteran of the airline. Outside his home in Drake, Massachusetts, the captain's extended family gathered, including his wife and 3 daughters. Ogonowski's brother Jim described him as a hero, a man who joined the Air Force out of patriotism during the Vietnam War and who viewed his work as an airline pilot his life's dream.
Our family is obviously grieving, as is the whole nation, for what has happened today. I personally, I think I'm in shock. I'm in some type of denial.
Official information about how the flights were seized and how Logan's security might have been breached is still under investigation and is closely held. Airport officials stress that security inside Logan's terminals, as elsewhere across America, is the responsibility of the separate airlines and that the airport itself was secure.
We've closed the airport to all arriving and all departing flights. We've increased our security measures. We've shut down all the construction sites within Logan Airport, both airside and landside.
At the Ogonowski home, official information is also apparently scarce. The pilot's brother Jim told reporters that the family had no information about what Captain Ogonowski went through or whether there were any communications between the pilot and FAA controllers. Wyatt Andrews, CBS News, Drake, Massachusetts.
Wyatt Andrews reporting from Boston. Dateline Philadelphia, Victor Saraceni of a Philadelphia suburb of Makefield Township is believed now to have been the pilot of the second plane to crash into the World Trade Center buildings. Also, Dateline Washington, it's now being said by the top Republican on the Senate Judiciary Committee, Senator Orrin Hatch, that there were some intercepts of some information that he says, quote, included people associated with bin Laden who acknowledged a couple of targets were hit. Hatch said this just a short while ago in an interview with Associated Press. He declined to be more specific. As the president's speech approaches, let's go back to Washington and CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent Bob Schieffer. Bob? Well, let's go to John Roberts quickly instead. Quick check off the line of scrimmage here. John Roberts, now back at the White House, allowed on the White House grounds. We're just a few minutes from the president making this, which by acclamation would be by far the most important speech of his presidency.
I would certainly say so, Dan, and this is also an enormous test for this new president. White House officials came out today and said that they would identify and bring to justice those responsible for these heinous acts, Dan, but with the scope and the enormity of this tragedy, I would imagine that just bringing them to justice is certainly not going to be enough for a lot of people. There will be a lot of people who are demanding swift, decisive, and punitive action against those responsible. We're told that in the president's address tonight, he will not even approach the issue of retaliation. He will offer words of resolve and reassurance, and he will express his condolences for the families of the victims of today's massive tragedies. And as you have said on and on throughout this day, Dan, we can't even begin to imagine how many people have died. Sources close to protecting the president say this was, in fact, just like Pearl Harbor, in that they had no indication that anything like this was afoot. There were no targets, if you will, that had come up on their very sensitive radar screen. And, Dan, it would seem that the 2,400 and some odd people who died in Pearl Harbor may be eclipsed by today's tragedy. The president expected to speak from the Oval Office in just a few moments' time.
John Roberts, live from the White House, and we'll be going back to the White House very shortly. There are no exact casualty figures. There are no figures even remotely exact from the World Trade Center bombings or, for that matter, at the Pentagon. In the few seconds we have remaining before the president speaks, let's go now to Bob Schieffer in Washington. Bob?
Well, Dan, the president will address a Congress and I think an audience of Americans. It will be a different group than he might have addressed last week. We had this incredible show of bipartisan support just a few minutes ago up on the Capitol steps where you saw hundreds of members of Congress come together and say, we support the president. We are going to support the president to do whatever is necessary to find whoever did this and to see that they are punished. It's the sort of thing you almost never see except in times of crisis. And we saw again today what you always see in times of crisis with the American people and their representatives in Congress. They come together as one. I think the president will get a very good reception for whatever he says today.
Bob Schieffer in Washington. Now, President Bush is going to address the nation in about a minute. As we wait for that, search and rescue operations stretch into the night here in New York City, hours after terrorists slammed 2 hijacked commercial airliners into the World Trade Center on the lower part of Manhattan Island. The Twin Towers, where 40 to 50,000 people work on their average day, crumpled to the ground. The full extent of death and injuries unknown. A fire department union official said, firemen's union official said earlier this evening that there may be as many as 200 New York City firefighters may be among the dead. One reason for that is when the first building was hit, firefighters were rushed to the scene, and then, of course, very quickly the second building was hit, and then fairly quickly after that, both buildings collapsed. A third building in the Trade Center complex collapsed this evening. A third hijacked plane, of course, was slammed into the seat of America's military might. The Pentagon had estimated at least 100 dead and or injured there. A fourth jetliner possibly being diverted to Washington or Camp David, the president's retreat, went down in southwestern Pennsylvania. All told, at least 250 people are aboard the 4 crashed planes. The FAA grounded all civilian aircraft until at least noon tomorrow. The Wall Street markets will be closed tomorrow. Now, President Bush was flown secretly today from Florida, first to Louisiana, then to Nebraska, but he's back in the White House now, and we have about 25 seconds till you will see President Bush address the nation from the White House. After the president speaks, our CBS News continuing coverage of events on this horrible, historic day will continue.
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices, secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shattered steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world. And no one will keep that light from shining. Today, our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature, and we responded with the best of America, with the daring of our rescue workers, with the caring for strangers and neighbors who came to give blood and help in any way they could. Immediately following the first attack, I implemented our government's emergency response plans. Our military is powerful, and it's prepared. Our emergency teams are working in New York City and Washington, D.C. to help with local rescue efforts. Our first priority is to get help to those who have been injured and to take every precaution to protect our citizens at home and around the world from further attacks. The functions of our government continue without interruption. Federal agencies in Washington, which had to be evacuated today, are reopening for essential personnel tonight and will be open for business tomorrow. Our financial institutions remain strong, and the American economy will be open for business as well. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. I appreciate so very much the members of Congress who have joined me in strongly condemning these attacks. And on behalf of the American people, I thank the many world leaders who have called to offer their condolences and assistance. America and our friends and allies join with all those who want peace and security in the world, and we stand together to win the war against terrorism. Tonight, I ask for your prayers for all those who grieve, for the children whose worlds have been shattered, for all whose sense of safety and security has been threatened. And I pray they will be comforted by a power greater than any of us, spoken through the ages in Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. This is a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world. Thank you. Good night, and God bless America.
President Bush speaking live from the Oval Office in the White House. Perhaps ominously, among the things the president said was, and this is not a direct quote, but it's on the money, we will not differentiate between those who committed these acts today and those who harbored them. The president vowed that no act of terror will darken America's beacon of freedom. We go now to CBS News Chief White House Correspondent John Roberts. John.
Dan, important words for the president to say that we will not differentiate between the terrorists who committed this act and those who harbor them. If this was, in fact, Osama bin Laden's group who was behind this, that message is aimed directly at the Taliban government. Though we should point out, Dan, that every indication we get from the White House tonight is that the explosions that we saw in Kabul tonight were not part of any American action. The White House has absolutely disavowed any connection to those, as has the Defense Department. The president also sending out some important words of reassurance tonight to Americans, saying that the government is still in operation, essential personnel will be back at work later on tonight, and that the government will be open for business tomorrow. And even though the stock market will be closed tomorrow, Dan, the president reassuring Americans, saying that the American economy will be open for business. The big message here tonight that the president was trying to send out was the idea that they can hit us, but they can't knock us down. He said that we have stared enemies in the face before, we have stared them down, and we will do this again. So the president, Dan, tonight using every ounce of resolve that he can muster to say the United States will recover from this enormous tragedy. Dan?
John Roberts at the White House. Now, U.S. officials are starting to piece together the case of what happened today, and in some instances they're piecing together what they see as links to Osama bin Laden for being responsible for the worst terrorist attack in U.S. history. That Orrin Hatch, the top Republican on the Senate Judiciary Committee tonight, said they, meaning intelligence operations, they have an intercept of some information that included people associated with bin Laden who acknowledged a couple of targets were hit. That's a direct quote from Senator Hatch. He went on to say that law enforcement has data possibly linking one person on one of the 4 ill-fated flights to bin Laden's organization. Now, government and industry officials say at least one flight attendant and 2 passengers called from 3 of the planes as they were being forced down in New York and Washington, each describing similar circumstances. The callers indicated the hijackers were, at least in the beginning, armed with knives. This day's horrific events began with the familiar turbine whine of jet engines over New York. But this Boeing 767 was too low and not in the regular flight pattern. It was aimed straight for the massive twin towers of the World Trade Center. It hit it. CBS's Byron Pitts is on the scene tonight. Byron?
Well, Dan, a few moments ago, a producer for 60 Minutes just walked back from the crime scene and said she counted only 4 floors left, 4 stories left of one of the 110-story towers. At this hour, rescue teams are still waiting, still hoping, still praying they will find survivors alive. Without exaggeration, Ground Zero looks like a battlefield.
8:48 a.m. Mayhem in Manhattan. We saw a plane coming very low, and everyone said, wow, that plane is very, very low.
Come on, guys, keep moving. I was walking to work, and all of a sudden, I see a jet crash into the first tower.
An American Airlines flight loaded with 92 people crashes head-on into the North Tower of the World Trade Center.
And then we heard the crash. We ran to the window.
Into the building. It went into the Trade Center.
We hit the Trade Center. We saw the shrapnel fall, and then we said, get out.
And minutes later.
Oh, there's another one. Another plane just hit. Right. Oh, my God. Another plane has just hit.
I heard a roar, and I looked around thinking that it had to be a helicopter, and I looked up, and I saw the second plane hit.
A second commercial plane, a United Airlines jet, also hijacked, carrying 65 people, plows into the South Tower.
First one we thought was an accident. When we heard there was a second one, we definitely thought it was terrorism.
On the ground, witnesses could not believe their eyes. 70 stories up with the building burning. Reason gave way to desperation. New York's bravest never had a chance.
We really never even got to that close to the building. An explosion blew and it knocked everybody over.
Less than an hour later, the South Tower came crumbling down.
It collapsed. The top floors collapsed down. I saw it blow and then ran like hell. Thank God. I'm 69, but I can still run.
But it was far from over.
Tower 2 collapsed into Tower 1. Within minutes after that, we were ordered out.
When the dust settled, signs of life started to emerge.
Chaos. It's just chaos out here. It really is. So the Twin Towers fall. It's amazing. It's crazy. I can't believe this shit is happening. I really can't. It's nightmares. Armageddon right here.
This was the worst act of terrorism on U.S. soil, but not the first attack on the World Trade Center. 8 years ago, terrorists set off bombs in the basement in an effort to take down the two towers. They failed. Today, mission accomplished.
I tell you what, it's a sad day for America. It really is.
By 2 o'clock this afternoon, firefighters and police officers and paramedics by the hundreds stood by, many of them feeling helpless. There was nothing they could do at this point because the building was still unsecured.
Our main priority is to get in, do a search and rescue, look for survivors, and then clean up what's left. And we can't do that until the building is deemed safe.
Ankle deep in debris and despair, rescue workers waited. Some had relatives of their own inside. One police officer told me her sister worked here on the 40th floor, due in at 9 a.m. She was always early, she said. Always. A sign on a paramedic's van spoke volumes.
We know we have some of the major brass of our department missing. We're trying to find them, too.
New York Port Authority Police Chief William Hall choked back tears. For him, this was no longer just work. On a personal level, because I know that these are all your men and it's a business, but I'm sure that a lot of these guys are your friends. How you helping
out?
Not
a business now, it's personal now.
Sir?
It's personal now. We have to get them.
Back live, we have had little relief here. Take a look at this. These pictures here, which are just... Hours ago, World Trade Center building number 7 collapsed. A 42-story building that crumbled hours after the initial devastation. It was the one calamity here that was not a surprise. Police had evacuated the area earlier, fearful building number 7 would indeed fall down. Minutes after the second tower collapsed, we met a firefighter named Tim McGee, a New York City firefighter. He was covered in soot from the top of his helmet to the bottom of his feet. He was crying. He told me that he had lost all of his men when the building collapsed. He asked us to reach his wife, Maria, tell her that he was okay, that he had survived. Quote, tell her, I love her. Dan.
Byron Pitts in Lower Manhattan. Mind you that the World Trade Center complex has 7 buildings. So the Twin Towers went down, they're the big ones, but then the 47-story World Trade Center building number 7 collapsed. That was near the end of Byron Pitts' report. Now, building 5 in the World Trade Center complex was for many hours today described as on the brink of collapse. The state of that building at this hour is uncertain. It was long ago evacuated completely. Now about today's other terror strike at the seat and symbol of U.S. military might, the U.S. Defense Department, the Pentagon, first opened in 1943, never before directly attacked. There were 64 people aboard American Flight 77, the jetliner hijackers used to ram into the Pentagon. CBS's David Martin reports the deadly impact there. David?
Dan, fires are still burning, but Pentagon officials say the flames are under control and the Pentagon will be open for business tomorrow. But Defense Secretary Rumsfeld had a grim warning that casualties will be high.
Some people have been lifted out and taken away in ambulances, and the numbers will be calculated, and it will not be a few.
The first attack ever on the Pentagon occurred at 9:38 a.m. Eastern Time.
Clipped this pole over here, hit another pole and slammed right into the building. Huge explosion, and then utter pandemonium, as you might imagine. I mean, everybody was screaming, "Oh my God."
A hijacked American Airlines jet, which had just taken off from Dulles Airport, flew right up the main highway leading north into Washington and straight into the citadel of American military power.
There was no doubt about it. It was American Airlines slammed right into the building, and there was no doubt about it. Whoever was piloting that plane was aiming for the Pentagon.
Fearful that, like the World Trade Center, a second airliner was on its way, most of the building's 23,000 workers fled.
Plane's coming in. Come on. Let's go. Come on. We're not playing around here. Let's go.
F-16 fighters circled overhead looking for a second attack, but the damage had already been done. The plane had drilled a hole about a third of the way through the world's largest office building. The wounded were rushed to nearby hospitals as the fire spread and an entire section of the building collapsed, trapping many, many more inside.
Arlington search and rescue personnel are just now, and it's about almost 2 o'clock, just now gaining access to portions of the building where the plane hit because the fires were too intense.
One ray of hope. The Pentagon is undergoing a major renovation, and some of the offices in the path of the plane were vacant.
We're trying to find out who made it out okay and account for the people that may not have made it out.
When the plane hit, Defense Secretary Rumsfeld moved from his office on the other side of the building into the National Military Command Center in the basement. With smoke hanging in the air, he ordered aircraft carriers, amphibious ships, cruisers, and destroyers to New York and Washington, where they can serve as floating hospitals, help with the cleanup, and provide air defense against the possibility of more attacks. And the chairman of the Joint Chiefs made a clear threat of military retaliation.
I have no intentions of discussing today what comes next, but make no mistake about it, your armed forces are ready.
Right now, suspicion focuses on Osama bin Laden, and we have some new pictures of this damage done to the Pentagon by whoever these terrorists were. First, really close-up pictures of the damage. I'm looking at it for the first time with you. I do not see any evidence there of the fuselage of the plane. Those are corridors I've walked down thousands of times, and right now they're unrecognizable. Back to you, Dan.
David Martin reporting live again from the Pentagon. New York City Mayor Rudolph Giuliani has confirmed that some of the first police officers and firefighters on the scene were killed. And the mayor added that in general, quote, the number of casualties will be more than most of us can bear. Mike Carter, vice president of the Firefighters Union here in New York City, estimates that half of the 400 firefighters who first reached the scene may, I underline that word, may be dead. I quote Mike Carter of the Firefighters Union, "We have entire companies that are just missing. We lost chiefs. We're going to have to bury a lot of people," Carter said. Roman Catholic Church Cardinal Edward Egan, who administered last rites to dozens of victims, said that the firefighters and police were, quote, dead in great numbers, quote unquote, the Cardinal. Police Department and union sources, speaking on condition of anonymity, said that 78 police officers were missing. However, Assistant Chief Tom Fahey said the number of known missing among police officers is not that high. The emergency medical service worker, Luis Garcia, said initial reports indicated that bodies were buried beneath the 2 feet at least, of soot on streets around the Trade Center. And Garcia said a lot of vehicles are running over bodies because bodies are all over the place. Garcia is a 15-year veteran who had 2 people die in his ambulance on the way to the hospital. That gives you some of the mood, the atmosphere, and some of the facts and eyewitness reports that are surround us here in New York City tonight. Now, to punish those behind today's attacks, the U.S. must first and foremost determine who there are. There's been much speculation about that today, but so far it's all speculation. The facts are few. Osama bin Laden, the renegade Saudi Arabian millionaire who was last reported in Afghanistan, he's widely believed to be in Afghanistan, is the most frequently mentioned suspect. But as we have before, for fairness and accuracy, it's dictated that we say nobody knows who committed these crimes today. But CBS's Jim Stewart in Washington is closely following the investigation and checking his many good sources. Jim, what can you tell us?
Dan, federal lawmen are apparently fanning out tonight to follow up on the first leads in this case. Some search warrants have been served, but officials caution it is too early to tell whether they will bear fruit. Other agents are poring over the flight manifest of the 4 doomed planes. Meanwhile, intelligence officials say they have developed what one calls significant indicators pointing to Osama bin Laden as the man behind this attack. The information suggests that the planes were hijacked by members of al-Qaeda, the terrorist group that reports to bin Laden. Sources describe the intelligence as communications intercepts. It's not definitive, said one official, but it is persuasive.
Sensing that bin Laden would quickly become a suspect, Afghanistan's ruling Taliban party, which has been giving him safe refuge, called a press conference. We do not allow Osama bin Laden to operate from our land, the Taliban said, warning the U.S. not to take any, quote, speedy actions to retaliate. Meanwhile, law enforcement sources said there had been no credible claims for the joint attacks and that intelligence had picked up no specific threats aimed at targets inside the United States before the attacks took place. Within minutes of today's attacks, officials were pointing to the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center by a group with ties to bin Laden, citing it as proof that bin Laden has never given up on his dream to destroy the symbol of America's economic power. And in recent months, analysts say bin Laden has only become more and more sophisticated in his attempts to strike at the United States. They point specifically to his simultaneous attack on 2 U.S. embassies in East Africa.
They also went directly against a U.S. destroyer, which was heavily guarded, and they did put a hole in that ship, the USS Cole. So they have a track record of conducting attacks that one would think they might not be capable of.
Late today, the U.S. intelligence community was rapidly sorting through a priority list of potential suspects within the U.S. for electronic eavesdropping, with sources saying the number may reach into the hundreds.
There is also specific physical evidence that investigators are eager to examine. First are the transcripts of communications between the suicide aircraft and ground controllers, including telephone calls from passengers to the ground, and second are cockpit tape recordings of conversations in the doomed aircraft. The working theory is that the hijackers were pilots themselves and forcefully took over the controls to dive the jets straight into their targets. Dan?
Jim Stewart reporting live from Washington. One of the few things that seems certain tonight is that the hijackings and attacks were meticulously planned and carried out with great precision. There's also a school of thought that says this kind of operation required a lot of financial resources. And there is a school of thought among intelligence operatives at high levels in this country and abroad that Osama bin Laden, despite the fact that he is a multimillionaire, that even bin Laden requires additional financial support from somewhere to carry out this kind of operation. Now, some of the speculation is supported by very few facts, if any. However, this thing being carried out with great precision is consistent with the hard facts. Somebody planned this thing exceptionally well. Correspondent Bob Orr, who covers aviation for CBS News, has pieced a lot of this together. Bob?
Well, Dan, it clearly was a highly coordinated attack this morning, launched with simultaneous breaches of security at 3 of the nation's busiest airports. Under the cover of the hectic morning rush when airports are particularly vulnerable, hijackers managed to board 4 large passenger jets, 2 each from American Airlines and United Airlines, 2 of the strongest symbols of U.S. aviation.
American Flight 11, a Boeing 767, took off first at 7:45 this morning from Boston, bound for Los Angeles. 13 minutes later, another 767, United Flight 175, also left Boston for L.A. At virtually the same moment, United Flight 93, a 757, took off from Newark for San Francisco. And to the south at Washington's Dulles Airport, another 757, American Flight 77, flew off towards Los Angeles. The first sign that anything was wrong was noticed by air traffic controllers, who watched the jets stray from their planned routes. This computerized radar path shows how the first plane, American Airlines Flight 11, climbed out of Boston and, as expected, headed northwest across Massachusetts. But watch what happened. As the plane entered eastern New York, it turned sharply to the south and headed straight for Manhattan. The 767 hit the World Trade Center at 8:48 this morning. And 16 minutes later, United Flight 175 delivered the second blow. The jets, fueled for cross-country flights, were filled with tens of thousands of gallons of volatile fuel. They were literally flying bombs, each with an explosive power far greater than the blast that leveled the Oklahoma City Federal Building. Based on radio communications from the planes, FAA authorities knew they were dealing with a terrorist attack and immediately moved to close New York and Washington airports. And for the first time in U.S. history, all flights across the country were grounded.
The airport's being evacuated. They need to go home.
But there were still two hijacked jets in the air, and one of them, American Airlines Flight 77, took aim on the Pentagon. It crashed in a fireball at 9:38. Meanwhile, the fourth plane, the flight from Newark to San Francisco, was heading west, and it traveled all the way into northeastern Ohio. The controllers monitoring radar watched as the jet then did a U-turn and headed back towards the East Coast. At 10:20, 2.5 hours after the four-pronged attack was launched, the plane crashed in a rural Pennsylvania field.
I happened to hear a plane come through. It sounded like it was running normally. When it come down over top of me, I seen it go nosedive straight into the ground down here. Everything was running fine on the plane, it sounded like.
Authorities say 285 people died aboard the airliners today, and tonight the FAA is at a loss to explain how the security failures happened. There is some new information that in at least two of the attacks, the hijackers may have used knives, and those are harder than guns for security officials to detect. But most importantly, remember this. These were suicide attacks, long known to be the very hardest to stop. There's no piece of equipment and no screener that absolutely can stop a terrorist who is willing to die. Dan?
Live in Washington, Bob Orr. There they were, the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, soaring symbols of American power and wealth. And in just minutes, there they weren't, reduced to rubble by faceless enemies. The world's most famous skyline changed forever by a horrendous, cowardly act of terror. CBS's Richard Schlesinger has more about the impact of an image that will last forever.
There's another one.
It is difficult to overestimate the power of these images.
Oh, my God.
Difficult to put into words what today's attacks have done to the nation. Calamities almost unparalleled in the country's history.
Pearl Harbor is one of the first things that comes to mind.
Evan Cornog is a historian and journalist at Columbia University. As the attack unfolded live before our eyes, it was hard not to be reminded of the most recent large-scale sneak attack, almost 60 years ago.
A date which will live in infamy.
After Pearl Harbor, there was the Japanese fleet to go after. One knew where to find the enemy. Here, it's a much more complicated issue.
Just as the U.S. Navy was a symbol of our power then, the Pentagon and the World Trade Center were symbols of our power now, our place in the world.
So those towers are saying, look at us, we're important. And somebody has come along and said, you're not as important as you think.
We are certainly not as invulnerable as we may have thought. For years, authorities have practiced for terrorist attacks, many times under the direction of Jerome Hauer, a former emergency management official in New York.
You have to plan for the worst. That's just, particularly in a city like in New York, in Washington, D.C., the real thing is never like a drill. The enormity of the situation today is just... is just incredible.
The symbolism of the attack was impossible to ignore overseas.
The feeling is that throughout the world, the Americans are not as powerful as they were thought to be. Therefore, these terrorists were really going to achieve a symbolic victory.
But officials here in New York and in Washington know the difference between a symbolic victory and a real victory. When the World Trade Center was brought to the ground, the country was brought to its knees. But terrorism experts say just for a while.
Did the bad guys win today? They got they got that image. They got they certainly just struck a blow today. There's no question about it. We are a very resilient nation, and we are very resilient people.
And we're a very different people than we were just before 9 o'clock this morning when this all began. Richard Schlesinger, CBS News, New York.
During this hour, President Bush said that the terror attacks today took, quote, thousands of lives. The search goes on tonight in the rubble of the World Trade Center towers struck this morning by 2 hijacked commercial jetliners, the worst terror attack ever on U.S. soil. President Bush vowed to find and punish those responsible. CBS News coverage of the attack on America will continue in a moment.